Welcome to Philosophy 15. I'm Scott Aiken.
And I'm Robert Talese.
We're the authors of Why We Argue and How We Should, A Guide to Political Disagreement in an Age of Unreason.
In its second edition.
And we're also the authors of another recently published book that's the topic of today's discussion, Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Nature of Philosophy. And today we're going to talk about a phenomenon that we're calling metaphysical, or metaphilosophical, not metaphysical, metaphilosophical creep. So what's metaphilosophy? It's kind of a mouthful. What's metaphilosophy?
So metaphilosophy,
and what's so creepy about it?
Yeah. Who are these metaphilosophical creeps? So metaphilosophy is a philosophical view about philosophy. That's literally what we could say it is. But metaphilosophies are views proffered by philosophers about the nature, the methods, the limitations, the aspirations, the proper categories or avenues by which philosophy gets conducted or ought to be conducted.
And so that's the first part of it, is that metaphilosophies have got sort of two components to them. On the one hand, they're descriptive, what philosophy is about, but then on the other hand, it's what philosophy is all about, right? Or it's what ought to be about, how to properly do it. So they've kind of got two faces. They describe philosophy on the one hand, and then they tell you how to do philosophy on the other hand.
That's right. Or we might say they describe philosophy as a way of furthering and proposing a project about how philosophy is properly conducted. Now, this book, Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Nature of Philosophy, the nature of philosophy part is about the metaphilosophical stuff.
Right.
And I guess one of the central themes running through the book is that pragmatism is perhaps, I don't want to say unique, but it is among the sort of traditions in mainstream philosophy in the history of the enterprise in the West. Pragmatism has been perhaps the most overtly and self-consciously metaphilosophical trajectory of philosophy.
That's right. Almost all the formative documents that we can think of in the pragmatist tradition are all reactionary documents. They all start effectively as Jeremiads as to how badly philosophy is getting done and how to set it on the right path.
That's right. Or just think about, just one example is Peirce's, the initiating document for pragmatism, where you first get the initial, albeit awkward but initial, nonetheless, articulation of the pragmatic maxim, is an essay entitled How to Make Our Ideas Clear. And one thing that's made clear in that essay is that the indictment of the essay is that philosophers up until Peirce have failed to make their ideas clear.
Right.
That there's a level of clarity or a kind of clarity to which ideas can aspire that not only have all prior philosophers failed to satisfy, but have even failed to conceptualize. So it's not as if they were failing to make their ideas clear and didn't know what to do about it. It's that they thought they were being clear and they're not.
And the same thing goes with any of the other formative documents in
James's pragmatism lectures.
That's exactly it. James' pragmatism lectures. In fact, James motivates pragmatism as a synthetic program between two extremes in the present dilemma of philosophy, between two extreme tempers of mind. And so we can do this for pretty much any of the pragmatist programs, that they're all in some ways reactionary programs to philosophy done badly. And so as a consequence, what seems to drive the pragmatist program is that it looks at philosophy and how it's done and says, boo, to that. Here's a corrective program, and here are the things that philosophy ought to be doing, and the corrective program is informed in light of that. And so with Peirce, it's going to be in terms of modeling something on the basis of science. With James, it's going to be in terms of something contributing to one, expressing one's temperament properly, and being able to be at home with that temperament. And that seems to be the case with pretty much all of the pragmatists that follow. That they look at the history of philosophy and say, there's something messed up about this. It's not doing the things that I want it to be doing. and as a consequence we need to change it. Now, in some regards, that's not objectionable, and what's creepy about that?
Well, okay, maybe there's nothing...
What's creepy about that?
Maybe there's nothing creepy about it.
Right.
But here's the worry. So the way in which, not only pragmatists, but pragmatists are perhaps most overtly committed to the strategy, is that the part of the work that the metaphilosophical corrective does for the pragmatist is that of dismissing certain pieces of vocabulary, certain kinds of categories, certain questions and problems wholesale.
Right, whole problems, right, whole discussions.
Right, so remember, in a letter to James, Peirce writes, pragmatism doesn't solve any problems. It just shows that the supposed problems aren't the real problems.
Right.
Famously, James, in the third chapter of the Pragmatism Lectures, Some Metaphysical Problems Pragmatically Considered, aims to show that the job that pragmatism does is it helps us to sort of redescribe traditional metaphysical disputes as conflicts of human psychological temperaments. That's a metaphilosophical move, right? It's saying the traditional philosophers have thought they were arguing about the structure of reality, when in fact, that structure of reality argument is really just a confused proxy for a conflict or a clash of human temperaments. Pragmatism helps you to see that fact, and then James says, and once you see that the debate between sort of materialists and spiritualists in metaphysics is really a clash of divergent human temperaments, then the problem gets redefined and admits of an easy solution.
So from these descriptive stories about how philosophy is done and what philosophy is about, then there's a kind of an ought statement supervenes on that, right? So you say, okay, given the fact that the history of philosophy is a history of the clash of these temperaments, a kind of ought, so here's how you ought to do philosophy in light of that fact. It's supposed to inform you in this regard.
That's right. So here's where the creep comes in. So once you see, or once you achieve some success with this kind of strategy, where take a long-standing philosophical dispute with some metaphilosophical principle, show how it's been misconstrued, misarticulated, how the categories aren't what they look to be. Once you change the metaphilosophical dispute into something else by way of a metaphilosophical gesture, once you see that that strategy can work in materialism and spiritualism, for example, or as Peirce deploys it in the debate over transubstantiation,
that's right?
Right?
Senseless jargon.
She says meaningless gibberish, right? Once you see that it works in one area, the temptation is to employ it across the whole
Right.
of first-order traditional philosophical disputes. And you get this somewhat in James, but where it really comes to the fore is in Dewey, where the pragmatism of Dewey is fundamentally committed to the thought that prior to pragmatism, first-order philosophical disputes are fundamentally misguided and confused. And once you see that they're fundamentally misguided and confused, you then come to see not that you can declare some statements within those debates as meaningless gibberish, as Peirce did, nor do you see with James that properly understood materialism and spiritualism are really to be interpreted as views about psychological temperaments, and therefore the dispute between them becomes tractable. Dewey says, no, once you understand that traditional philosophical problems are misarticulated, you see that those aren't problems at all. They don't need a solution. They don't need a resolution. They don't even need a reinterpretation. They just need to be cast to the side of the road like chaff, is what he says. So the creep is creeping right? Just like mission creep, as we talk about in the military. The pragmatists, we argue, at least one of the central theses of the book, is that the pragmatists over-deploy this strategy. Pragmatism is a philosophical idiom that carries with it a vulnerability. The vulnerability is to regard every long-standing, difficult, seemingly intractable, deeply puzzling philosophical problem as ipso facto misarticulated,
Right.
and something to be gotten over.
So there's a first level to this, which is the long-standingness of philosophical problems is evidence of their pointlessness, right? So that's
Right,
one
right.
element,
Or their malformedness.
Right? Or their malformedness, right?
Yeah.
That they're in need of that kind of the pragmatist philosophical clarity. But there's a second edge to this, which shows up especially in James, shows up in Dewey too. But James is particularly clear on this, where James then says, well, look, once I've deployed these categories and start clearing the field here, presumably these philosophical traditionalists will say something to me about the second order thing that I've said. But that's a mere expression of their temperament too.
Right.
Right? And that's a kind of an expression of, again, and part of this pragmatist strategy is to say that the reason why philosophical problems, or especially in the Jamesian program, are so intractable is because of the fact that they're just mere expressions of extreme instances of these temperaments, right? The tough-minded and the tender-minded, for example, seem to be the sort of the staunch ones. James seems to think that folks are in the middle, and so can kind of pick and choose, or at the very least have synthetic versions of them. But whenever the philosophical traditionalist says, no, whenever I'm asking whether or not there's such a thing as free will, I'm not trying to be a free will determinist.
Right.
Right? Which is one of James's strategies, to say that, well, look, we're kind of a both and. We think that the world's kind of determined all the way down, but I kind of like the idea of freedom, so I'm going to be a free will determinist, and that's an expression of the kind of temperament I got. That's the Jamesian strategy. But if someone says, well, look, that's a contradiction. You can't have free will and not have free will. You can't be a free will determinist. That's a contradiction. James would say, oh, you poor your sentiment is you're such an extremist with regards to propositionalism that expresses a strange extremist sentiment on your behalf. And so notice that as a consequence, the pragmatist can't hear any of the criticisms of the pragmatist program as anything more than just the expressions of the sentiments that they've already diagnosed.
Right, and as if it's not clear why that's problematic, an unwelcome result for a fallibilist, experimentalist philosophical project, we'll put a finer point on it. So the pragmatist becomes incapable of hearing an anti or non-pragmatist theses as philosophical. That's a problematic.
That's right.
Now, every critical thought about the pragmatist proposal now is an occasion for metaphilosophical diagnosis rather than philosophical argumentation. That's no way to be a fallibilist. And there's nothing experimental about it. It's a strategy that insulates the pragmatist from critique.
But here's here's the question. What makes metaphilosophy in this regard so appealing? Why in the world would it be so appealing? Now, again, it would be appealing because it seems that it seals off your view from criticism. That's appealing in that regard. But why in the world would somebody do that? And maybe it's because of the fact that it plays a kind of an explanatory role. Whenever we're able to explain and see certain kinds of philosophical debates from the kind of perspectives that motivate them and animate them. So if you can say, like, look, I understand why the free will debate is so trenchant and so important. Why? Because of the fact that then you explain why free will means something to folks, what's so appealing about the determinist view, and that you look at it from this metaphilosophical perspective, you can explain how the debate has the contours it does. So that's one of the appeals of, you might say, jumping up to the second order, but the problem is that it comes with a kind of cost, and namely that second order then becomes to then rule the day as to what counts as a proper philosophical question and solution.
Yeah, everything becomes second order, and that's obviously incoherent.
And there's not any content to the second order anymore.
Philosophy 15, folks. Thanks for joining us.